So, welcome everyone to this week's Birkbeck Connections video. Birkbeck Connections in Organisational Psychology aims to bring together our professional community to connect and share the latest evidence and trends in practice, and more importantly, learn from each other. We want to invite academics, current students, alumni, anyone really interested in the field of organisational psychology to join us. When possible, we will be doing this face-to-face and holding quarterly discussions. But at the moment, to take advantage of our opportunity, we're doing this video series and sharing some really important, pertinent research and experience from members of the Department of Organisational Psychology at Birkbeck. Today, I'm thrilled to say we're joined by Dr Susan Kahn. Susan's a chartered psychologist and program director for the Masters in Coaching Psychology at Birkbeck. Her particular interest is behaviour of people at work and below the surface dynamics in organisations. She's written 2 books. One is called Death in the City, which uses psychoanalysis to explore organisational endings, and it's to this we're going to turn our attention today. So even in the midst of endings, death is this taboo subject, and with what we're facing now with the onset of likely recession and the impact that we're going to have in terms of considerable hardship on the economy, we're going to see that endings are going to be fast and frequent in the workplace. What we're going to do in this interview is take the opportunity to pause and contemplate this subject. So Susan, I want to start with that line about and the idea of even in the midst of endings, death remains a taboo subject. Why do you think it is so hard for us to talk about death?
It's a really interesting question, and it's one that I've spent a lot of my research time thinking about. Rochefoucauld had this wonderful quote, which was that neither the sun nor death can be looked at directly. And it has a kind of resonance in that it feels like something that's uncomfortable to talk about. It's sort of in hushed tones. As soon as we hear of some kind of loss or redundancy or ending, we immediately kind of tilt our head and lower our voices and talk in a different way. And it's a very curious thing because death is the only thing that we can all be certain of. We all know that we are going to end our lives at some point, and we hope that our lives will be long and fulfilled and our endings will be good, but we know we're going to face the end, and yet still it remains something which is kind of almost off the agenda. It's a cultural thing, I think, in the UK, but it is slowly changing. Podcasts like The Big C and Me, where people are talking about their cancer and their illness and their inevitable death, but how they're embracing life in between. Things like the death cafes, which you may have heard of, where people come together to talk about mourning, and public figures like Clive James and George Elagaya, who are naming the fact that they are living with illness and are likely to have a death earlier than they thought. So things are shifting, but it remains deeply uncomfortable, perhaps because loss is so painful. And Freud would say we find it impossible to contemplate our own deaths. So there are some thoughts.
Fascinating, that idea of it becoming more commonplace. I was reflecting on this last night watching Ricky Gervais's Afterlife series.
Yeah.
I don't think that would have happened 10 years ago, perhaps. Our ability to sit through this and see it almost in a light-hearted context, as well as sit with the pain and the humour in it.
And it's interesting historically as well, because if we think about Victorian times, there was very much a sort of a celebration and a ritual around death, you know, in terms of what we said and the way we sort of dressed our homes and what were the clothes we wore. And yet now the emphasis organisationally and personally seems to be get back to it, get on with life. And I think particularly now in the midst of this crisis, we're going to be facing a lot of individuals and organisations, as you say, who are really struggling with loss. And it's something we do need to pay attention to.
Yeah. In your book, you talk about it in the context of organisational endings. And that's something we're seeing on a daily basis, aren't we, in the media in terms of organisations. When you were doing your research on this, what did you observe around the kind of behaviours that these all ending or dying organisations engaged in?
I mean, firstly, it was the most fascinating opportunity to actually observe an organisation in collapse, to actually see what went on. The organisation, the institution I was observing, gave me the sort of kind of front row seat over a period of 18 months to watch their slow collapse. And I think what was very interesting to observe was the variety of responses, but many of them were defensive. And, when we think about defense mechanisms, they are there to protect us from kind of unbearable anxiety and pain. And many of those defenses were there. The first links to what we've spoken about already, denial, the fact that people find it very difficult to accept that their business is going to collapse, or that there are going to be redundancies, or that they indeed might lose their job. So there's an element of kind of burying your head in the sand and not considering the reality of what you're facing. And that was certainly the case in the financial sector, who believed that these boom times were just going to carry on and on and on. And then in terms of leadership, I often witnessed a sort of a mania, a manic response to what was going on, almost the sense that if I do all these things in a really kind of creative and fast way, then the reality of our collapse is not going to happen. So that was a very curious kind of example. There was also a lot of strange behaviour around celebration. Again, every event was celebrated, birthdays, religious holidays. So there was that going on. And in the midst of it is, I think, a sort of a very sort of binary response to the loss. On the one hand, a quite healthy mourning attitude. Freud's seminal paper on mourning and melancholia speaks to this so beautifully, and a lot of people are put off by Freud, but this paper is short and really interesting, and I'd really encourage people to look at it. But he differentiates between mourning and melancholia, and this is very much what I saw in this organisation that was going through this slow demise. Some people responded with a healthy recognition that their jobs were coming to the end, that their work was closing. There was a sense of a kind of, obvious sadness and disappointment and, financial pain, but it was something that could be worked through as a normal process, something which they could look back on and emerge from. And there were others, and this is the sort of very worrying element of loss, that get stuck in a melancholic state, that they're unable to extract themselves from the situation they're in, and they become an extreme form of denial. They're stuck in their loss, and this can prove to be very detrimental to individual's health, to the organisation, and to the ability to move on. It's a pathological response to endings, and that's something that we saw. I saw in a number of leaders and a number of sort of departments that were running. So I took a psychoanalytic lens, so I was looking a lot at defensive behaviour, but they were some of the things that I observed, and I see going on now too.
Yes, reflecting on your ideas of healthy types of behaviour. So this idea of being more open and accepting and talking about it in an honest way, it's almost a process related way. Have you seen? Can there be a good end for organisations? So what could happen? Do you think?
Well, I think we all hope for a good life and a good end, and I think organisations, although they can be in denial about the fact that there is going to be an end, can also, I think, plan for a good end. It doesn't mean it will be pain-free, but if we think about occasions where organisations are put together for an event, like the Olympic Committee 2012, very successful could look back at the work they've done with pride, a sense of community, a sense of a job well done. And I think that in terms of a good end, if you feel that you've had scope and capacity to do the work that the organisation, the business was set up to do, then you can, of course, feel difficulty, but you can look back with some sense of pride and leave that organisation. But it could be still painful, and the hope is that the loss is more akin to a mourning process than that of a melancholic end. I don't know whether this is sort of relevant here in terms of good endings, but there is a sort of a notion of almost sort of kind of psychic deadness that can exist in individuals, where they're going through the motions at work. They're not really engaged in what's going on. They're sort of they're there because they have to be, and in those instances, the organisation persists, but the individual is somewhat dead within the organisation. And there's an interesting sort of some writing by Cederstrom and Fleming that talk about dead man working. So sustaining the organisation at any cost is not necessarily the best option either.
Mm. And so, reflecting on that at the moment, we obviously have some organisations that are collapsing and therefore dying, but we have a huge amount of organisations that are struggling and in a very precarious or fragile position at the moment. How can you relate to your findings and your research to this in terms of what should they be doing, or how should they be communicating at the moment?
I mean, I think leadership in these fragile times is both demanding and essential. And this notion of sort of containment, the ability to hold your people and your clients and your stakeholders in a way that they feel safe enough to continue with their work is vital. So I think as far as leaders are concerned, it's a question of communication. It's a question of being open and honest, even if that news is bad news, and creating a climate of trust that that your leaders will tell you what needs to be known, without fear of having things hidden. Because I think very often in organisations, when business is bad, when markets are bad, when there's a sense that things are going to collapse, the most awful thing is the imagined things that people have, what they think might be going on. So as far as leadership is concerned, I think containment, providing sort of a trust in that relationship and communication is really important.
Yes, it's fascinating, this idea of trust, isn't it, and communication. We've just been doing some research looking at reviews into remote working and how to create an environment where remote working can. Again, remote working is about making sure that you have clear communication, consistent communication, and making sure there's trust. Because at the moment, those things are harder to achieve when we are working remotely. So do you think at the moment there will be greater challenges than normal in terms of this being able to work in a healthy way and communicate in a healthy way?
I mean, in some ways, I think it'll be more challenging, and in others, we've seen that our teams and people can be trusted. There was, I think, a sort of a reticence about allowing people to work in a flexible way, in an agile way, that the work won't be done. And I think the major lesson we've all learned through this is, my goodness, we can respond quickly. We can work in different environments. And I think that's actually one of the really pleasing things that's come out of this. But I think obviously everyone is different, and there will be some leaders who are struggling themselves. So to have that demand on them to also be providing containment and trust, and it can actually be perhaps a lot. But I have seen examples of organisations really doing everything they can to provide that support with guidance and open space to talk and time to think. And I think that's been very encouraging to see.
It's good. It's really good to hear a hopeful spin. I'm trying to maintain optimism, the opportunity that this whole situation can achieve for us.
Isn't it interesting that we're talking about death and we're trying to hold on yet to the optimism? So yeah.
So, but I guess the last thing is relating it back to personal situations of death and dying. So obviously, the great tragedy is during the pandemic, many are experiencing loss and mourning in their personal lives. So, for I guess the last question being about how can your research around organisational endings help us to understand endings in our personal life?
Yeah, I think that when we have a loss, we feel it emotionally, we feel it physically, and we also feel it intellectually. It interferes with the way we are able to process information. And I think that kind of visceral experience of loss is something which is very much echoed in the workplace. And of course, it's not the same as the life lost of a treasured person in your life, but it is something that's very much caught up in our identity. We are very much the person we present in the workplace. That there's a way to go before we sort of are seen holistically in all our sort of multiple roles. So I think that there's a lot of similarity, and I think that there's also similarity in the way that people respond differently to loss. Some people want to just get back on with their lives. They don't want to be treated differently. The issue of time is a very sort of personal issue, you know, how quickly people respond to their loss. And I suppose from an organisational point of view, we can just learn to listen to our employees, to make sure that there's space to talk, to allow them to tell us what would be helpful to them in terms of managing their loss. I mean, we can't escape from an organisational perspective that loss also has an economic cost, and you know, there's some interesting research by Hazan's been done, and you know, grieving employees are obviously not as productive as healthy, well employees. So there's some interesting work with Cantor Fitzgerald post the 9/11 sort of tragedy, and how they turned their sort of communal grief and suffering to something productive. So I think it's personal, but I think that paying attention to it is the most important thing, not to sweep it under the carpet, and to make sure that people are, you know, memento mori, you know, remember you will die, and to think about it, and to therefore embrace life and deal with grief in a tender and a sensitive way as you can.
And going back to that quote that really resonated with me from the beginning in terms of being prepared to look towards the sun.
Yes, yeah.
Thank you, Susan. It's been so fascinating, wonderful talk to you. Thank you.
Oh, thank you for giving me the chance to chat. Thank you, Rachel.
So next week's video is going to be with Dr. Jo Yarker, and she and I are going to be talking about the reintegration. So what happens next, how we should transition into the workplace, how we are going to deal with post-pandemic working and reworking.
I look forward to that.
Thank you, and a pleasure again, Susan. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.